Oh, they changed the thing. It used to say, this meeting is being recorded. Welcome everybody to the first Critical Internationalization Studies meeting of the academic year in the Northern Hemisphere. I know it's not, but generally speaking, it's not universal. I don't want to universalize. That's one thing we're trying not to do, but for many of us, it is sort of the beginning of the school year. I'm Sharon Stein. I'm the convener of the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, and I am speaking to you from traditional ancestral unceded Musqueam territory in what is currently known as Vancouver. And it's a particularly relevant day to be noting that because it is the first ever National Truth and Reconciliation Day in what is currently known as Canada. So for those who don't know much about it, Canada from the late 19th century until 1996 had an Indian residential school system in which over 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools, ripped from their families, and experiencing physical, sexual, psychological abuse. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada completed its final report about these schools in 2015 and deemed that they were a part of a system of cultural genocide. They have 94 calls to action, many of which are focused on education. And in 1993, there has been an Orange Shirt Day to honor survivors of residential schools. And then it was always on September 30th. And this year is the first day that National Truth and Reconciliation Day is a statutory federal holiday. Of course, there are many different perspectives on reconciliation, including many critiques from Indigenous peoples who say that it is a means for the government to, or has been mobilized as a means for the government to deflect its responsibilities to Indigenous peoples for redress and reparation and land rematriation. But nonetheless, we use it as a day to think about our responsibilities to Indigenous peoples, which is really something we should be doing every day. But I just wanted to also invite us to spend time, if we haven't already, thinking about this interface of different forms of colonialism. We often talk about sort of global imperialism or colonialism and thinking about internationalization, but how does that relate to settler colonization in places like the US or Canada? And I don't think we've really even scratched the surface of that conversation. I'm just going to share in the chat a resource that tries to move in this direction a tiny bit, which is a letter from an Indigenous person to a prospective immigrant to Canada, in this case. That is something that I've used with my own international students to help them make sense of the context that they're coming into. But it's an incomplete resource, and what we need is more spaces for deeper conversations about these kinds of things. So that is my invitation to you all, and would welcome anyone who wants to talk further about that in the context of the network. But today we have a very special speaker, Sachi Edwards, who is a tenure-track lecturer in the Graduate School of International Peace Studies at Soka University in Tokyo, Japan. We're very happy to have Sachi here, and understanding that she's very flexible with us so that it's a time that can be reasonable for us in the US and Canada mostly. So thank you, Sachi, for being flexible. Sachi has graduate degrees in religious studies and international education policy. She brings an interdisciplinary perspective to the study of internationalization, globalization, and intercultural education. And we're very happy you're here. And I will cede the floor. And then once Dr. Edwards finishes her talk, we can have some Q&A and conversation. So over to you, Sachi.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's 8 a.m. for me, and thank you for hanging in there in the evening for those of you who are in a time zone that you are in the evening hours. Thanks for sharing about the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada, Sharon. And I just want to note, since it's related to the topic of my presentation, that Christianity and assimilation to Christianity was a big part of the residential schools in Canada and North America. And so, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about how, my whole presentation is essentially how I see Christianity embedded in all of these processes. And of course, these ideas are still in progress. And so I'm eager to talk to you all about it and get your ideas as well. So I will share my screen. All right, so I titled this Considering Globalized Christian Supremacy and Our Discourse About Higher Education Internationalization, primarily because I think about the way that we are having this conversation about the way that internationalization represents Westernization, even marketization. Folks in this network have written about how it represents or is sort of a manifestation of neocolonialism and globalizing whiteness and perpetuating epistemic dominance. But the question that I want to ask and discuss is, where does Christian supremacy belong in this conversation, right? Globalized Christian supremacy. And I included this picture here, which is titled American Progress, because I think this is sort of exemplary of the Christian worldview, where progress is inevitable and desirable, and there's some sort of future that is more modern, and that Christianity will help bring that. And it requires pushing out old, barbaric, mostly indigenous spiritual cultural systems and processes of education as well. So I should introduce myself first and talk a little bit about my relationship to this topic and how I even got here. So I was born and raised in Hawaii. This is a picture of me in Hawaii. Those are my two children. I also have a very loving and supportive spouse, but for anyone who has children probably knows it's difficult to get pictures together. Let's see, that shapes a lot, like being born and raised in Hawaii shapes a lot about how I understand the world and how I see this topic. I was also raised in a multi-generational home full of Japanese women. I'm a fourth generation Japanese American, I guess you could say, in Hawaii, although Hawaii was not considered America and is still not considered America by many folks. It's considered a illegally occupied sovereign nation. But yeah, I was raised not to necessarily think of myself as American, but Japanese, which is weird for me to be back here in Japan working now, because I am considered a foreigner here. But I also was raised, so my Japanese side of the family that I was raised around is Buddhist, and so that was a big part of my cultural religious practice. But I also have a Hindu father, and that was a big part of my home life, right? This is a picture of my eldest in our home prayer room that my father maintains. But my father's also not Indian. And so he has been Hindu for most of his life. And so I'm a second generation Hindu, I guess you could say, but I'm not Indian. So I feel very I feel very much like an outsider in Hindu spaces as well. And then the other side of me is that I learned as an adult that my grandfather, who is the bottom left here with no shoes on, my great-grandparents' generation migrated to Hawaii as laborers on the sugar plantations. And I was very close with my grandfather. I lived with him for many years as a child. But I learned after he died, when I was, in my late 20s, that he had Ainu heritage, that he was Ainu, and that he never told me that. And so that has been a big sort of shift in my life. Since then, I've connected with other Ainu and diaspora communities, many who have the exact same story about learning later in life, and that there are tragic stories about why and how people kept that part of themselves secret. And so, that has shaped the way that I understand transnational indigenous issues, and also the role of Japan and Japanese imperialism, even in the land that is now considered Japan. Other elements of me that relate to this topic: I got a master's degree in religious studies at the University of Hawaii. I focused on Polynesian traditions. I got a PhD in international education policy from the University of Maryland. And I now work at Soka University, which is a Buddhist university, which is, again, shapes the way that I see religion embedded in internationalization of higher education. And so I want to sort of get on the right page with everyone about what I mean when I talk about religion and Christianity, right? So there are long-standing debates in the field of religious studies about how you even define a religion, right? So on the one hand, there's the substantivist definition, which is admittedly the dominant perspective in the field of religious studies. And that is that religion is defined by theistic belief. But on the other hand, there is the functionalist definition, which argues that the substantivist definition, to define religion based on theistic belief, and to what extent people believe or not believe what is supposed in what they are supposed to believe in their tradition, is completely inaccurate and exclusivist to those traditions, which there are many, who do not espouse any sort of theistic belief, or who don't prioritize that at all. Maybe they do, but that's certainly not the important part of the religious tradition. And so the functionalist definition of religion says that religion should be defined and understood by the way that it shapes societal norms, values, and behaviors, right? So from that perspective, when I talk about Christianity, I'm not talking about some kind of a professed faith or theology, right? I'm talking about the onto-epistemological frame of Christianity, the stuff that is embedded in someone's worldview that doesn't actually have anything to do with what they believe theistically, right? These are some books if you want to learn more about that debate, or actually not the debate. If you want to learn more about the functionalist perspective and the non-Christian, non-Western perspective, these are some good books to read. I think it's important then also to talk about the Enlightenment, because the idea that religion and science are separate things, are in some ways positioned as opposite things, was really born out of the Enlightenment, right? Prior to that, the line between what was religion and what was science, or what was religion and what was secular philosophy, wasn't as clear. And in many traditions and cultures around the world, many religious and spiritual traditions and cultures around the world, that line still is not, there is no clear line between them, right? They blur together quite a bit. And so it's important to note that the Enlightenment, which is where a lot of our, what we would consider, dominant fields of study, sociology, philosophy, religious studies, even comparative education, kind of rooted from that period of time. And so in those fields, there are some deeply rooted Christian cultural perspectives in there, right? But the Enlightenment was a political and theological break from the church. The Enlightenment was not a cultural, epistemic, ontological break, right? And so the idea of secularism being some kind of a religiously neutral space is false, right? Certainly secularism can take different forms in different contexts, but Western secularism is certainly Christian in nature. And so what are some examples of that, right? For instance, the way that we see the nature of the self, which is what we call in academia ontology, right? We have, on the one hand, an independent self that is real and exists. And on the other hand, there are many traditions, Buddhism, for instance, that says there is no such thing as an independent self, right? You cannot exist without a relation, without being in relation with other entities around you. The same is true for the concept of agency, right? We often think of agency as something that we have independent control over. It's our agency to control things outside of ourselves. Whereas in other cultural contexts, agency is more of an interdependent function, right? Agency functions to, the function of agency is for you to sort of modify your behavior dependent on the important relationships around you and to ensure harmony around you, right? There's also the idea of linear time, which is sort of a Christian idea, versus spatial or relational orientations to history. I think about, for instance, the Japanese way of counting the years is not like continuous, but it's dependent on the emperor, right? And I'm not endorsing that as being superior or anything, but it's certainly a different way of orienting yourself to history, right? Also the inevitability of progression, which I said earlier, right? That inevitably we will move from barbarianism to modernity, that we will move from these like wild superstitions to this more sensical monotheism, that communal systems of social function will inevitably move towards an organized capitalism and private ownership. Also universally relevant principles of ethics, the idea that ethics can be universal, that making ethical determinations, as opposed to making ethical determinations based on sort of real people's in the moment collective decision making. And I think the human rights agenda is implicated here. The universal human rights agenda is implicated here, right? Hannah Waits has done some really interesting work around the way that the global mission, Christian Mission Project has embedded human right, the right to proselytize into the human rights agenda, and the way that that has then shaped the way that they influence politics and religious movements back in the United States and in other predominantly Christian countries. There's also the idea that the written word and alphabetic literacy is superior to oral or visual literacies. The idea that knowledge creation is that observable and measurable data is superior to versus relationally or genealogically constructed knowledge, right? The idea that you could collect some data and say that you understand an issue versus the idea that, no, you need to like be in a deep relationship with this topic or this phenomenon in order for you to say that you understand it, sometimes over generations. So another point here is that, modern formal education is often understood as being inherently good, or even when there are problems with it, it just needs to be sort of modified slightly. But Vine Deloria talks about formal education as the secular counterpart of teaching and preaching, right? Which goes back to the experience of Native peoples in North America with these residential schools. And then just the idea, of course, that advancements in technology and control over nature is an indication of progress. We see that quite a bit. So when I describe this phenomenon of Christian supremacy, I want to kind of talk about the different ways that you can talk about this phenomenon. So some people use the term Christian privilege, which I define as a set of sociocultural advantages. Some people prefer the word Christian hegemony, which is really sort of a sociopolitical dominance. And I do use that word when I think it's appropriate. Christian normativity is another one, right? The assumption that Christian beliefs and systems or ways of operating and overall cultural worldview are somehow universal or universally relevant. But I most often choose to use the phrase Christian supremacy, which is the assumption that these Christian norms are not only universally relevant, but that they are better or superior to other religio-spiritual norms. Because I do really feel that that is the sentiment embedded in the idea that these norms are and or should be universal, right? So how do I see Christianization in internationalization? So on the one hand, right, Western ontology and epistemology are Christian, period. In the context of higher education, right, the global spread of the hegemony of Western science over and above all other forms of knowledge creation. De Sousa Santos refers to this as epistemic injustice or cognitive injustice. It really does represent the spread of a secular Christian cultural worldview, right? When we think about marketization, which often comes along with these internationalization initiatives, we have to remember that capitalism was also developed in a Christian context, right? Through its function as the government and as the largest landowner in Western Europe, the church designed an economic labor system that would maintain its own power. And this was the precursor to what we would understand as modern capitalism. So this system was and still is in to many people seen as divinely inspired and inherently good. And the acceptance of that system is seen as a sign of modernity, and those who resist it were seen as evil and that they deserve to be conquered. And we still see this today, right? That acceptance of capitalism is seen as a marker of modernization, right? And then we also see marketization described as innovation, right? In higher education spaces. I don't know, many of you may have seen in your campuses that innovation and entrepreneurship are often sort of tied together in the rhetoric in the way that they are discussed. And then, of course, there's the idea that colonization and neocolonialism is Christianization, right? Of course, Christianity was a core pillar of colonization. There are people like Mignolo and Quijano and Maldonado Torres that have written about this extensively. Right, humans were categorized hierarchically based on religion even before racial categories and hierarchies existed. And Mignolo explains that post-Enlightenment, the rhetoric of salvation by conversion to Christianity was simply translated into the rhetoric of salvation by the civilizing mission, and then later to the rhetoric of this global economic project under the name of development and modernization. So we see sort of rhetoric about developing and modernizing higher education systems in the global South, really pervasively. And then also the idea even of the nation state as a concept can be in some ways understood as sort of a Christian apparatus, right? Strict nation state borders were not common prior to colonialism. And this economic labor system that I described that was developed in this Christian context by the church was also developed in the colonies, right? To maintain this exploitative relationship between the church and the colonies. And so even when formal decolonization happened in some places, the bureaucratic systems that were established to continue oversight, they were largely maintained. There was a different person in power, right? So these newly supposedly sovereign nation state, but this structure of the bureaucratic system and the definition of the borders was still imposed, right, by colonists and particularly the church. And so, I'm sure many of you know that the creation of these borders was extremely violent processes, and they have lasting and devastating impacts that we still see today. And so in this sense, the very nature of what we even consider international, or what we even consider like crossing borders, right, is bound up in this system that was created by the church through colonialism. And then, of course, whiteness and Christianness are bound together as well. So, as non-Europeans began converting to Christianity, and this question of, oh, well, they're Christian now, do they get access to this sort of power, right? And so in order to maintain the social hierarchy, racial categories, so that the rhetoric sort of shifted to racial categories rather than religious categories. And Christian supremacy and white supremacy continue to function today in the way that Kathy Joshi describes it, as two sides of a wide ribbon that twists throughout history, right? We don't always see both sides at the same time, but they are one and the same, and they function together to keep out non-Christian people of color from positions of power, right? And so, Christianness is often seen as sort of a redeeming quality or a sign of modernity for people of color. And at the same time, whiteness is seen as a redeeming quality or a sign of normalcy for folks who are not Christian. And so, these concepts are really difficult to separate if you think about it. And so when we're talking about these, Western systems, Western models of higher education that are being spread around the world, we're talking about models of higher education that were designed very explicitly to promote Christianity. And despite, some of them transitioning away from any kind of formal affiliation with a religious denomination, their foundational mode of operation is certainly still rooted in Christian norms. And when we see them spreading themselves around the world through their idea that their approach to higher education and their value is universal, we can sort of easily recognize the Christian worldview in that assumption, right? In the United States, it wasn't until the 1950s that many public universities stopped attending, and these weren't even like formally affiliated with a church, right? But these are public institutions that were requiring students to attend chapel services. My grandfather's brother, for instance, this is like well before the 1950s, but he, got a scholarship to attend the University of Hawaii, and part of his scholarship required that he live in a dorm that was, his resident assistant or whatever was a Christian priest, and that part of his, scholarship was that he needed to attend weekly church services, and this was like a public scholarship, right? And so, folks like to think of this past as being like a really long time ago, but this legacy is really only mildly obscured, I would say, today, right? There are overtly Christian spaces on these campuses. This image is from Harvard, which is the first university in, settler colonial United States. Again, established to promote Christianity and to train Christian priests. And these overtly Christian spaces are still there, and they're often used for initiatives that are supposedly meant for interfaith or, quote unquote, religious diversity initiatives. And then, another thing to note, and that, Melissa Watley, she's here in this meeting, I think, has done some really interesting work around the fact that, explicitly missionary work is sometimes done through these international initiatives. Study abroad, for instance, right? Either like through the formal, institution-run study abroad initiatives, or even through like public-private partnerships, where these external organizations will organize these missionary projects and then partner with the universities to offer credit for the students who are doing this. And so there are lots of ways that it's bound up, right, in internationalization projects. And so I'm in the context of Japan, right? So what the context that I'm dealing with here, or that I'm situated in here, right? Japan has a very strong history of resistance to the West and Christianity. And the gunboat diplomacy that we all know of, Josephson writes about digs into some of the history about it, and writes about the way that it was motivated in part by the drive to spread Christianity. And the reaction to that from the Japanese government, because at the time, there was they didn't really understand the concept of religion. So what they did was they sort of reformulated Shinto into a state religion, to one that the US could recognize as a religion, in order to sort of match, I would say, and to demonstrate that, oh, we already have a religion, so we don't need yours. Today, religion is still largely understood here in Japan, and I would say in many places in the world, in Christian terms, right? And theistic belief, organized religion in the Christian sense is the way that people understand what religion is and being religious is. And so there's often the assumption, even among the Japanese population, that Japanese people are not religious. And so you'll see sometimes on surveys or scales of religiosity around the world that Japan is way down there, or way up there, however you would say, in the number of people who are not religious. But then on the other hand, 90+% of people identify with both Shinto and Buddhism. So, or at least some form of Shinto. Either there's state Shinto, which is one thing, and then there's folk Shinto, which is another thing. But most people certainly engage in practices that could be described as either of those things, but still think that they're not religious, right? Because they're using a Christian definition to understand what it means to be religious. Also here in Japan, there certainly is an active pursuit of internationalization policy from the government, but there's actually quite a bit of resistance that I've realized over the last couple years, talking to people and studying this issue, is that there is quite a bit of resistance from some faculty and administrators who see that internationalization is Westernization, and they don't really like it. And so there is some resistance, and there's kind of, those who are supportive think of the others as being inward looking and conservative, and those who are resistant to it see those promoting internationalization as just being sort of caught up in this Westernization fad. And then the other thing that's really interesting to me that I have recognized here is that Christian universities in Japan are seen as progressive because they are, have historically been oppressed by the Japanese government, which is true. But as a result, they're seen as sort of like a challenge to like the establishment, and therefore is seen as progressive. So like feminist causes or other sort of progressive causes are often attributed to these Christian universities. They're also seen as inherently international, just, whether or not their student body population is has a high number of international students or not, the fact that they are Christian makes them, students are attracted to that. Japanese students are attracted to that because it means that they're going to have an international experience, whether or not they're interested in the Christian part. And so I think that, some of you may have read Riyadh and Kirsten Edwards's Whiteness as Futurity paper recently, which I did, which I thought it was helpful in articulating some of these ideas. But, I really saw Christianness embedded in that as well. So what I wanted to do is take the framework that they created and try to articulate how I can apply Christianness to that as well. So they talk about whiteness as they talk about whiteness as aspiration, right? And so when I think about that in terms of Christianness, I think that, linear time positions folk religion in the past as being sort of archaic, and that Christianity is the future, right? They also talk about the way that whiteness is embedded in or that the promotion of English language learning around the world is a perpetuation of whiteness. But it's also important to remember that Christianity is embedded in the English language as well, in certain terms like heavenly or holiday or grace, or even popular concepts like YOLO, right? These are like, make sense from a Christian framework, but they're used commonly in English. So in that way, Christianity is really embedded in the English language. And then just like Christian university models as the ideal, right? As what you're aspiring to, what Japanese institutions are aspiring to. They also talk about whiteness as investment, right? And so when I apply that to Christianity, I can see that the globalization of Christianity certainly makes it difficult not to invest in Christian institutions, right? There are the major sort of government policy initiatives related to funding schemes for internationalization processes here in Japan. They're giving money to Christian universities to as part of these schemes, right? Because they're seen as inherently international, because they have more international potential, etc. And then, of course, Christianity is also embedded in the business sector as well, which students and institutions want to partner with, right, for the sake of their future economic security. I've heard a lot about students here in Japan who are attracted to or want to attend these Christian universities because they know that it gives them access to job networks or networks that make it more likely that they'll get a job afterwards, right? Then they also talk about whiteness as being malleable. And I think malleability is a key feature of Christianity, right? Despite historically non-Christian communities, i.e. non-white folks, remaining subordinate in the eyes of Christian supremacy. And that even when not necessarily adopting Christianity like Japan, societies and governments will re-articulate their religion and culture through a Christian lens, again, like Japan, right? And so in this way, Christianity, or at least the way of understanding religion is promoted around the world and is kind of malleable in the form and function that it takes, but it's still sort of embedded in this Christian onto-epistemological frame. So they also, in their paper, they also talk about two different pathways that this happens, right? So on the one hand, they talk about the global diffusion of education. And liberal education, of course, is the product of the Enlightenment. So it has Christian legacies, right? It promotes individualist thinking versus perhaps collectivist thinking. It uses the English language, at least in the movement to perpetuate liberal education globally. It makes sort of universalist assumptions. And then also I find it very interesting that when anyone talks about alternatives to European liberal education and the way that some of these, the core skills or concepts that are embedded in liberal education, that we can see them in other traditions, we name them as, Confucian or Hindu or Muslim. But yet when we talk about European liberal education, we don't name it as fundamentally Christian, right? And I think that is a missed opportunity to be honest about what we're talking about and put them in conversation with each other. Then the second pathway that they discuss is the growing use of global university rankings, right? They talk about the way that it's the origins of global university rankings were in the movement to identify and reproduce great men, which of course great men, what they mean is white men, right? But it's also been described that origin, the origin movement of developing these global university rankings has been described as an attempt to understand the divine soul and how education can be used to create, to develop students into carriers of progress, right? And this was, that Columbia University was central in this, and there were, of course it was there were all the people who were in charge there were devout Christians, and the next generation of the Christian priests who who were foundational in the origin of the higher education system in the United States. So Choler and Martich draw the line very directly from the Scottish Protestant Reformation through Columbia and this process to PISA, to the development of PISA, right? And I know PISA is not necessarily higher education, but the idea that you can create some sort of universal standard that's globally applicable to compare students from all areas of the world, right? Which is what global university rankings attempt to do, right? To make some kind of globally relevant standard to compare universities across the board. And it's, I think it's important to note that most of the universities that are consistently in the top of these global university rankings were originated as Christian universities, and some still are, right? So there's Oxford, Cambridge, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, there are most of the top 10 are historically Christian, and still have that legacy, right? So other examples that I can discuss from Japan is the issue of calendars, right? One of the challenges of internationalization and promoting student mobility and things like that is that syncing up calendars, right? And so I think about that. Also, in the United States, when we talk about recognizing Christian normativity or Christian hegemony embedded in institutions, one of the major conversations that we have is the issue of calendars. How is our weekly and annual calendar set up, right? And so we see that in Japan, right? The weeks are aligned with the Christian calendar. We have Sundays off. Our annual vacations, we don't have the same annual calendar as the United States. For instance, our school year starts in April and ends in January. And I thought it was really interesting coming here to a Buddhist university and finding out that I have 2 weeks off over Christmas, despite the fact that it's in the middle of a semester. It's not even between semesters, right? And so I got really curious about that. And I realized that it's actually not common in Japan to have Christmas off because of the fact that it's in the middle of a semester. But I looked at all of the academic calendars so there's this big project called Top Global University, where the government has given tons of money to 37 universities to internationalize themselves. And there are different categories, right? And so I looked at all of the private universities I looked at all of the universities who are in the global traction category, which is, these are the universities that are not quite sort of up there in the ability to reach the global top 100 global rankings, but they have the potential to, and so this money is supposed to get them there, help them get there. And most of those in the global traction category did have this big 2-week break off for Christmas, despite the fact that that's not necessarily common or standard across the board. And when I looked at the private universities, which have more control over their operations than the public universities or the national universities, all of them had that 2-week break off. So I can't say direct causation or anything, but I think it's interesting that in the middle of a semester we would have 2 weeks off for Christmas, right? But the idea here is that we're trying to align with and attract international folks. But when we say international folks, what we mean are white Christians, right? Or people from Christian dominant countries. And then also, as I said, counting the years, I mentioned earlier that Japan does not count its years according to the, linear time. And so of course there's always the option to name the Christian year, and they are explicit when they say that. They call it the Christian year. But for instance, this year in Japan is not 2021, it's Reiwa 3, right? Because it's the 3rd year of the current emperor. And so when, I always have the option to put in 2021, but on official documents, it always gets converted to Reiwa 3, right? And so, that's another example of the way that we orient the whole world onto a Christian sort of framework, despite the fact that places like Japan are trying to maintain their own system of counting years in this, when we talk about this particular example. Another example that I want to share with you is from a Buddhist university, not my Buddhist university, but I was interested to talk to folks at this university, because I was interested in talking to most folks from various Buddhist universities around Japan. And a lot of people told me when I said that I was going to go and talk to them, I was going to visit their campus. They're just very, they're just conservative and they don't do international, they're like resistant to internationalization. Like, it's not worth talking to them. And then even when I, found I was connected to a faculty member there who does do some sort of international exchange initiatives, even he was like, yeah, nobody at my university is interested in internationalization, right? But I still talked to some folks, and I sat down with the president of the university even, and he was telling me how, the origin of their university was in this like conference of Buddhist scholars from all across the Asian continent who came to study, and that they maintain this really active sort of Center for Buddhist Studies where they send people abroad to learn about from other Buddhist scholars about various versions of Buddhist teachings, and that they bring Buddhist scholars from all over the world. And he himself, the president, had spent sort of 3 years, had taken, I think, like an extended sabbatical for 3 years to go and study in India. And I was like, well, that sounds like internationalization to me. And he, prior to that, he had even said to me, oh yeah, because I had asked him, like, do you all do any international initiatives? And he was like, no, we don't really do that. Like, we're kind of exempt from that because we're a Buddhist university. Exempt from pressure from the government is what he was saying. But then when I pointed out that I think that what they're doing with regard to their, like, the history of their university, and also this like Buddhist studies program, sounds very international to me. And he kind of like was like, his jaw dropped, and he was so excited that I would even consider that internationalization, right? Or that it was some sort of, that it would be described as international in nature. Because he had been trained not to think of that as international because it was only within Asia, right? That it didn't engage the West, and therefore it wasn't international. And so I'm not trying to sort of advocate for Bukkyo University or for this particular Buddhist studies program, but I'm just trying to point out that, there are things that universities are doing that definitely involve cross-border knowledge sharing that are not identified as being international in nature, simply because they're not engaging with the West, which I think is problematic. And then the last thing I'll share is an example of the University of the Ryukyus, which is in what is now called Okinawa. And they have engaged in, so Okinawa has been engaged in a long struggle for independence from Japan. And, when I first started, working with these folks or collaborating with these folks a few years ago, their approach to internationalization was to engage and build sort of solidarity networks with Okinawans in diaspora, Ryukyuans in diaspora, for the purpose of strengthening their sovereignty movement at home, right? And so international collaboration was for a completely different purpose than what you might, think of from the Western frame of like personal gain and learning a new culture. Since then, they've started a new international initiative, which I think is equally interesting, and is that it's sort of a collaboration for sort of solid coalition building around climate activism, right? So they're very intentionally partnering, they are a Pacific island, and they're very intentionally partnering with other institutions from other Pacific islands who are, as we all know, one of the most vulnerable when it comes to climate change because of their low, what is the word is escaping me.
Sea level?
What was that?
The sea level.
Yes. Sea level rise is they're vulnerable to sea level rise more than most, right? And they also, Okinawa is also in a certain geographic position where they receive a lot of the world's trash that are in the oceans. And so what they have done is they have a two-pronged approach to trying to create international partners. On the one hand, they're partnering specifically with Pacific Island nations to like hear more about their concerns, share more, ideas about ways that they are handling it or ways that they are promoting, they're engaging in activism in their own contexts. And then they're partnering with Japanese universities for the purpose of making more noise and hopefully getting the Japanese government to pay attention to their cause, right? And so I think this is a really interesting example of the type of internationalization that's happening here in Japan that moves beyond this Western Christian frame of like modernization and Western science and technology and universalizing liberal education, but also ethics and morality and modernity. So of course, with the pandemic, my ability to engage more with other folks who are doing internationalization in Japan, and certainly to visit these campuses, has been a challenge. And so, this is something that I'm interested in working more on in the coming years, months and years, to learn more about, some of the ways that internationalization is happening here and that are counter to, or maybe separate from, the Western Christian model, but then also to observe and note when I can see sort of Christian supremacy creeping into the ways that internationalization is discussed, but also pursued. Oh my gosh, what have I done? My screen is being wonky. Okay. Anyway, that's the end. If you want to talk more, that's my email address. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Sachi. That was wonderful and a much needed intervention in the field. I'm sure you're probably like tired of saying it, but for many of us, it's a new angle that clearly warrants a lot more consideration. And I have a whole list of questions, but I won't abuse my role as the host. I'll let others ask their questions first. So you can definitely put them in the chat if you want, or there's just a handful of us here. So I think we can have people just sort of speak up and raise their hands or signal that they want to speak. Yeah, Tessa, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Sachi. That was such an interesting analysis of how internationalization is affected by Christianity. I had a couple of questions. I myself come from India, where there are more ancient than some of the Western Christian practices of religion. We have Christianity, Orthodox, and various developments of Christianity in India from 2000 years ago. And those Orthodox Christian religions exist in other Eastern or non-Western contexts. And I was wondering if when you think about your onto-epistemological framework for approaching how you see society and then higher education influenced by norms that are possibly attributed to Christianity, do you attribute them in particular to the Western developments of Christianity? Because in my experience is limited. I haven't studied religious studies per se, but this is from my own experiences, that in Eastern forms of Christianity, there seems to be more collectivist, more community forms of practice and concepts. And I was wondering whether any of the pre-Christian so-called Western philosophies that are then taken up by Western Christianity, how much those influence some of the concepts that have then been in development in colonization and supremacy, dominance, for instance, agency, private property, race, dominance. Those come often from, Greek philosophy, which are then taken up by Christianity. So I wonder if you could comment a little bit on those 2 points.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that it gets to the malleability of Christianity, right? So there's lots of forms of Christianity around the world, and there's an entire field of world Christianities that compares these different evolutions of Christianity in different contexts. Certainly there are some elements of what I attributed to Western Christianity that are not as prevalent in other forms of Christianity. But I think sort of the idea of salvation, the idea of progress, the idea of universalism, I think, those are maintained in these other forms of Christianity, even when there are forms of Christianity that, as you say, are embrace more collectivist values or ways of being. And so I think that they are related, and that, I say Western Christianity in particular, of course, white Western Christianity especially, but I don't think that the lines are clear, and I don't think that we can say that it's only Western Christianity that has these, where these ideas are embedded, and the idea that they are somehow universally relevant are embedded. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. I wonder if you could also comment on the pre-Christian philosophies that influence some of these ideas that you raised.
Right. So, again, with the malleability of Christianity kind of like sucks things into its orbit and uses it as it sees fit. And so there are certainly, in the way that we see pre-Christian values and philosophies embedded in Western Christianity, we see other values and philosophies embedded in Christianity in other parts of the world. And so I think, yeah, those are present. They're always present in wherever Christianity, lands and grows. But I think that's part of the sort of universalizing nature of it, and the way that Shah Jahan and Edwards talk about it in terms of like the way that it is malleable, but it spreads, and then it is kind of obscured, but it's always this aspirational thing, and it's always seen as universally relevant, and it's just very linear and progress focused rather than like very rooted and situated in a particular place, in a particular relationship. But again, the intensity, of course, is most present in Western Christianity, and the way that it has evolved, and the way that we see it continuing to be promoted around the world is most prevalent at the hands of, for instance, the American Christian Mission Project, less so in other at the hands of other Christian communities. But I don't want to completely separate other Christian communities.
Thank you.
I have a question. I just want to thank you very much, Sachi, for this marvelous presentation, because it brings to me the whole idea of what Christianity is here in the US. And I'm most reminded of that by a book I'm just finishing up reading called Decoding the Digital Church. in which a friend of mine spent years listening to megachurch pastors. Megachurch. These churches reach 26,000 people at a time. And there are 10 or 12, 15, 20 of them all around the US doing this. And social media has made it easy to provide this. And they put their services on the web. So she began looking at this in terms of the election of Donald Trump and in terms of the recession that happened earlier in 2008. And she found exactly the same thing that you summarized for us, that, you know, progressive, you got to look to the future, but you got to be traditional. And she said, you know, if you want, you know, churches here are prohibited from making political statements. So they didn't do that. He would say, I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I am telling you to take the platform of the Republican Party and compare that to the Bible. Okay, and in doing so, you'll find out who to vote for. And then they would go on and make commentary about how the guy was better than the gal, and so would, you know, kind of convince them that they were on that side of the picture. But the important thing is that they had a platform, they had a megaphone, and they had the ability to influence a whole lot of people. In other words, to embed, as you're saying, and that's critical, this whole concept of embedding, to embed in their minds what it is about themselves. What she was calling American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's sort of Christian exceptionalism. And when you listen to the pastors, it's Christian exceptionalism. And I just wanted to bring that to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing. I hadn't heard of that book. Absolutely. When we think about American exceptionalism, they're talking about Christians. They're not talking about non-Christian Americans. No.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Thanks for sharing this, Tom. I'm gonna check this out.
I can explain it a little bit. It's
Sure.
Reverend Kawakami. He's a Buddhist monk in Kyoto, and he gives just a really, he's very traditional Buddhist monk, but he's also very high tech. And it's a very nice presentation about a non-Western, non-Christian perception of how to deal with the SDGs, for example. And so something worth checking out.
Yeah,
Great
no,
talk,
thank
by
you.
the way.
Thank you. My Zemi that I'm designing for next year is about the SDGs, so I'm gonna look into that.
He's very approachable. If you, Soka University is in Kyoto, right?
No, Soka University is in Tokyo, but I go down to Kyoto. Well, prior to the pandemic, I was in Kyoto a lot because there are a lot of Buddhist universities in Kyoto. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions? Thanks, Michael, for sending that. Okay, I'll go then. Okay, it's going to be like a two-part question because they're related, and plus I just have lots of questions, so I'm trying to condense. So one question would be, what is it, when you think about your scholarship or your role as sort of a researcher and academic, what is it that you would like your work to move in the world? So that's like part one. And then part two is, in this effort to move toward whatever it is that you're moving toward, what are the biggest forms of resistance that you meet in terms of people, you know, getting very defensive or being in denial, and how do you disarm those defenses and that pushback? Or like, any thoughts about that? Because that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about too, in parallel, not the same work, but like parallel conversations. That would be great to hear about those things.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. I think that, you know, I started talking about Christian supremacy with like a much grander view of what I was going to accomplish. And then I quickly realized that I would just be happy if I could get people to acknowledge that this is a real thing. Because I got so much pushback, as you said. And, you know, a lot of the pushback that I got was not necessarily even from folks who were like conservative Christians and really held on to that idea, but it was from folks who saw themselves as folks who were like white and culturally Christian, but who saw themselves as progressive and removed from Christianity because they have chosen not to describe themselves that way anymore, right? And so when I start talking about the way that Christianity is embedded sort of onto epistemologically, they're like, no, like you can't say that, you can't say that they, but what they were saying, I think, was I have a Christian worldview because I have said that I do not, you know? And so I think that to try to disarm them, I've tried to just, I think I've had to step back and explain all of this like foundational religious studies stuff, right? That like, I'm not talking about your theology, I'm not talking about what you believe. I'm talking about the way that you see the world, the way that you've been trained, the way that you've been socialized, what you think is normal, right? Because of the fact that that's not the way that everyone sees the world, and that's not what everyone thinks is normal. And so to try to pull it off of them and make it so that I'm not saying, you know, kind of like the issue of racism, white supremacy, it's like the problem of Christian supremacy is not what you're doing, you individual, right? It's the system. And so when I'm critiquing Christianity and Christian supremacy, I'm not critiquing you personally, right? I'm trying to like have a conversation about how this system of Christian supremacy is embedded, certainly in the US context, definitely in you know, other Canada, Europe, but it's spreading globally. And in order for us to counteract it or to try to resist it, we need to even recognize that it's happening. And we need to be able to talk about it honestly, right? So so instead of describing what they do in this place as Confucianism and what they do in this place as Hinduism, but then what they do in Europe is secular. No, like we need to admit that it's Christianity, you know, and that has a big role in it, the theology and the onto-epistemic frame, right? So, I mean, ultimately what I want for the field is to recognize that and to have more discussions about it. I don't want to be like screaming into the void. Like I want more people to engage in this conversation with me. But, you know, what I want to move towards is like more of what decolonial scholars would call like a pluriverse, right? Where I'm not saying that Christianity needs to be eliminated from the planet. Like I'm just saying that it needs to be put more on a level playing field with other forms of knowledge, with other approaches to spirituality, religion, and culture, to recognize that it's not universal and maybe it doesn't belong everywhere. You know, we can learn from it in certain things, but it's not more important or more valuable from other religious, spiritual, cultural traditions and forms of knowledge.
Mic drop. Yeah, that move of de-universalizing and showing people that like you are not neutral and you do not just get to decide like, oh, I'm a Christian supremacist or not, because it's not really about what you say or your sort of thought out beliefs, but like a habit of being. It's so difficult to get through that defensiveness.
Yeah. And I have noticed that I even get these kind of very very defensive, very aggressive comments, even from people who are like super on board with like, you know, smash the patriarchy and like, you know, anti-racism, like, you know, fight against white supremacy. And then when I'm like, and Christian supremacy, and they're like, no, absolutely not. So it, you know, and then for many people, on the one hand, it's like they don't want to recognize the way that they are complicit in that, and they were socialized in that, and that's their worldview. But then on the other hand, you know, some of them use their Christian faith as the motivator for these other social justice actions, which, you know, is great, but then also please recognize what I'm saying.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw that I don't know if they have a prime minister or president of Spain was very critical of the Pope's apology to Mexico on their like Day of Independence about the role of the Catholic Church in colonization. I don't know if he said it like that, but then the president of Spain was like, no way, Spain was amazing, and we brought Catholicism and we brought progress. This is like a, you know, not even this is a young, fairly young, you know, woman prime minister saying this. So yeah, anyway, it's a difficult road.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment here about what you just said, Sachi, regarding how people really reject this whole idea of, some people reject this whole idea that there is what you're talking about, this Christian hegemony of thinking, embeddedness, and so on. I edited a journal, and one of the articles I had several years ago was about NGOs going to places where there are crises in the world and trying to help people out. But one criteria for being helped out was to more or less convert, or more or less, you know, be part of the Christian way of doing things.
Oh, that is common. That is very common.
Yes.
Christian missionaries are so in there in the development sector. It's scary.
It is, isn't it?
And they, you know, I know people and families who have been personally affected by this, where they were the threat of being denied healthcare for a like critical medical condition. And so they converted to Christianity in order to receive medical care, you know? This is very common, yeah. But even in the development sector, in terms of like teaching people how to, when we think about like gender development and education, like teach, you know, Christian missionary organizations are deeply embedded in those projects as well. And, you know, bringing progress through teaching girls how to be, right? Like what gender roles do you need to fulfill? And this is sort of how they're going about educating girls in this like global mission to educate more girls, right? They're like teaching them how to fit into this, you know, certain gender role as part of their, you know, gender ideology that's embedded in their Christianity.
Yeah, I think like an open question that I don't, it's not specific to your work or mine, but it's so much of the kind of decolonizing or critical work is like, because what we're critiquing is often what, as you said, like people's sense of exceptionalism. If their mind and like sort of mode of being is organized by this sense of like, there are people on top and there are people on bottom. And then if we say, okay, well, actually your supremacy is, we see it and it's a problem and it's harmful, then they assume, okay, if I'm not at the top, then I must be shit. Like, because they're still thinking in this like hierarchical mode of the good and the bad people. And so one question I like have, not even just in my work on internationalization, is like, how do we interrupt that and say like, everybody at zero, like there's no this or that. But if they're working with that mindset, to interrupt it without like a great deal of like dancing around it, it really comes back to either they push back on you to defend and be like, no, I am up here, or they say, okay, if I'm not up here, I must be down here.
Right.
How do we get out of that trap? It's terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. Or even just like the idea that if you need to like get on other people's level and not always be at the top, then the idea that that feels like oppression, right? Because, well, but I'm used to being the normal one. I'm used to being the one that like, that, you know, that can attribute my values everywhere and that everyone wants to be like in my orbit. And no, we're asking you to actually take yourself out of the center. And that feels like, oh, you're trying to knock me down, right?
Yeah, Emily, you can be a nice lady and still benefit from white Christian supremacy.
Oh yeah.
There should be an article title that, or a blog.
There is a good article by Emily Todd? No, someone named Todd. I can get you the citation if you want, but the article is titled Confessions from a Christian Supremacist. And it's an article by this white woman who talks about how she identifies as Christian, she identifies as a progressive Christian, but then like her process of coming to terms with the fact that, oh, she does have this embedded Christian supremacist mindset, and that it's the right thing to do to name that and say it out loud rather than to try to hide from it.
Yeah, accept without endorsing that that's the way things are.
Yes, exactly.
All right, well, I know it's your morning and you have probably lots of work to get to, and I know that people here probably need to go and eat dinner or go to sleep. But I really am so grateful for your presentation. I think it's, as I said, so needed for the field to have this as part of the conversation. And I hope you'll continue to do this work despite the difficulties, and let us know how we can support.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me and giving me the space to vent. No
problem, anytime.
Okay.
All right, thank you all.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for coming.